Thank you, Max. In this presentation, I would like to share with you my personal opinion about some scientific aspects that stands behind the search for foreshock. In particular, I'm going to talk about two different approaches of studying foreshocks that are really popular right now. And I would like also to discuss a little bit what we know about foreshock, what I think we know about foreshock, and what we certainly don't know about that. And just at the end, few thoughts about the future. Okay, let me say we have two different families. There is some sort of cluster view, I call it cluster view, in which the models describe the space-time clustering of earthquake. The most important point is that that model make a forecast of the expected number of events, but they do not encode any information about the magnitude of that specific events, that they are randomly sampled from a frequency magnitude distribution, like for instance Gutenberg Richter. So the most important point is that for this kind of family, there are no foreshock at all. Foreshock can be identified only after the fact. Any earthquake is exactly the same as all the others. In the second view, that is a precursory view, there are retrospective evidence showing that some specific aspect of foreshock bring information on the magnitude of the next earthquake. There are a lot of examples about that. This example include energy acceleration, b-value variation in time, foreshock associated with slow slip events, and I think that some of the next speakers is going to talk about that in particular. Spatial distribution, proximity to seismic gap, etc., etc. So those two views are not, of course, really sharply separated, but most of the time in scientific literature you can find those two different kinds of approach. So if you just read all the papers, you can perceive that both views are both rooted to solid physics argument and can be justified or rejected mostly by cherry picking, not necessarily implicitly cherry picking retrospective cases. But I would like to convince you that physical plausibility may be a sine qua non conditions for that, but it cannot be used to evaluate the reliability of a model. This is really important. In my experience, I think that it is very easy to justify from a physical point of view many observations, but this does not mean that these observations are real features that can be extrapolated also for the future. So I think that the real distinction between these two views can be distinguished only through prospective testing. And I would like to convince you that I can't emphasize enough the importance of prospective testing. And I started to become convinced about that a few years ago when I read this really important commentary on Nature, where science went wrong. I don't know if the people is really aware about how the people outside our community perceive our research. This kind of commentary published on Nature, and there is a similar commentary published on Science, contain very strong statements against science. I just report some of them. The business of science is not about truth or reality, it's about transient vogues. Normal science is a fairy tale. Equal time should be given to competing avenues such as astrology and witchcraft, something like that. Having lost their monopoly in their production of knowledge, scientists have also lost their privileged status in society. For the scientists, the party is over. Something like that. This is the way said by the former Secretary of State of the Education of Science, or many important philosophers. This is the way in which some people outside our business perceive us. And of course, this is very important also to give an answer, to say, no, we are scientists, we have some specific business that is different from the others, and the way in which we can try to convince people is not very easy. This is just a very nice statement made by Nobel Prize Peter Medawar about the difficulty that scientists have to convince people that we are really gaining some knowledge about the nature. To me, the most convincing answer, reply to the critiques made by scientists has been made by AAAS in a very nice paper published a few years ago. the growing ability of scientists to make accurate prediction about natural phenomena provides convincing evidence that we are really gaining in our understanding of how the world works. So this is very important, in particular the word accurate prediction. Accurate prediction does not mean necessarily about the future, but for Foreshock, for instance, or for our business, the forecast of the future seismic activity is something that can really distinguish scientists from others. What is the activity that we are trying, in seismology, that is trying to tackle seriously this issue is the collaborator for the study of earthquake predictability. In particular, here you see that there are many regions of the world. For instance, I mentioned California, Italy, Japan, New Zealand, the Western Pacific, and also all the globe, where different models are run, and their forecasts are compared with the real seismicity. So let me make, for instance, describe CSEP experiment in a nutshell. The main goal is to compare forecast prediction of different models with real observation in truly prospective tests. So really about the future, forecasting time windows 1 day, 3 months, 1 year, 5 years. At the present state, now, only cluster view models are under testing. So this is one of the biggest limitations that we have. And also another interesting product that is something that is not really scientific, but I think that such a kind of model are really important because providing quantitative forecasts, they fill the bridge between our business, science, and the decision making. Some decision makers say, if you want to make a distinction between your business, my business, you have to provide me quantitative information, not just saying there is an increase in a hazard, something like that. You have tried to provide some quantitative assessment. And the models that are used for testing can provide such a kind of information. So here, let me show you one very preliminary results for instance, for the 1 day models. This is a couple of models that are related to the cluster view of Foreshock, ETAS, and STEP, applied in California. The 3 colors represent the percentage of time in which the model described well the seismicity in California since 2007 to 2013. On the upper right box, you can see the time windows. And so M-test and test means M-test describe well the magnitude distribution of the events. N-test means describe well, thank you. N-test describe well the number of events that we really observed. S-test, that means that earthquake occurred spatially exactly where the model expected to see them. So this means that 95% of the time, the models are able to describe, both models are able to describe well what happened in California in this time frame in a purely prospective test. So now, using this cluster view, what we can see about the skill of these models show consistency with observation. So these models are able to provide a good consistency with what we are going to observe, the highest information gain relative to a long-term forecast. Short-term forecasts are continuously under prospective testing. CSEP experiment provide in principle one thing that is very important that I'm going to talk a little bit more later, the self-similarity from small to large earthquake. Most of the critiques say, okay, but usually what you test is the magnitude from 4 to 6. You are not saying too much about magnitude 8. Of course, it is much more difficult to have enough statistics for a magnitude 8, but what such a kind of model are able to provide a good test for medium magnitude and see that also the largest magnitude do not have any specific difference from them. Forecasting skill of cluster model is rather modest. Usually weekly probability of large event rarely reach a few percent. Let me show you just an example what happened before Tohoku. Just a few days before Tohoku, this is the weekly probability just after the magnitude 7, before the magnitude 9, the probability to have a magnitude 8.5 or larger was about 0.12% per week. This probability gain was more than 100 times larger than the background seismicity. This is the kind of skill that we can get with this clustering model. Okay, so what we know is mostly related to the results of really prospective experiments that give a measure of if the models are really able to describe what we are observing. And let me talk about what we know we don't know. In particular, as I told you before, the results of system model testing are driven by target events with a smaller magnitude, for instance, from 4 to 6. Many people say, okay, well, but you are not saying too much about magnitude 8. Again, testing only for the largest earthquake may be prohibitive, in particular if we have a limited amount of time. However, so we still don't know if the preparatory phase for, say, M5 and 8 class of earthquake are really equal. The only thing that we can say is, okay, our models are able to describe well magnitude from 4 to 6, say something reasonable also for the large events. But again, this is something that we should try to investigate. CSEP testing can say something. Of course, the biggest limitation is the number of events that you have for testing. Many observations are not monitored in real time, and potentially they may provide useful insight to provide forecast skill. I think that this is something that people probably in the later talks are going to discuss. I've seen very spectacular example of Foreshocks activity before, in particular before large event on tectonic and subduction zone. So this is the biggest limitation, because if we don't have in real time such a kind of information, it will be very difficult for us to make under test this innovative model. But I would like also in particular to emphasize this point. In my view, there is now a big gap. There is a lot of very nice paper published on top journals about what has been observed for large events, and very, very few efforts to move from this interesting hypothesis to model that can be tested in the future. I know usually top journals are not particularly interested in such a kind of transition, but again, in my view, this is fundamental if we want to try to understand exactly, to understand really what is, if we know something more about the occurrence of earthquake. So a few thoughts about the future. The last mile problem, again, I echo myself what I said before. Scientists should spend more time and energy to make their models testable. This is the only way in which we can do actually significant steps ahead. Enhancing prospective testing, because testing is essential for science and for practical purposes. This means also we should try to make our capability to test much stronger in order also to test different kinds of hypotheses related to earthquake occurrence. And increasing the availability of different real-time observation is a sine qua non condition to achieve substantial increment of earthquake forecasting skill. So, thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for questions. I have a question. You mentioned it might be difficult to move from some of the recently proposed hypotheses about foreshocks to testable models. What do you see as the major barriers, and how could we overcome them?
Yeah, I have to say that looking at the kind of hypothesis, there are a wide range of difficulties. There is not only one specific difficulties, but I think that the people is very, to me, one of the feelings that I have when they publish an important paper, they don't feel the need to go a little bit more ahead and to make that model testable. What I'm trying to do here, in particular for the younger people, is just to say, okay, to do science is not enough to get a very important, good hypothesis. You have tried to move it ahead, and just to say, okay, if my hypothesis is correct, this is what I expect to see in the next future. And this is, I'm trying to convince people about the importance to do that.